You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, with Donald Trump's sentencing in his New York trial fast approaching, this is something we've spoken about offline, but I thought it was especially important to have this video right here. Can you talk about the way in which Donald Trump is going to be especially focused on delaying his New York sentencing, something that he's clearly very intent on doing?
Yeah, Brian, he's been trying to delay that sentencing for a very long time now. The last thing he wants is for Judge Merchan to, hand down a prison term for him. And here's the thing. There's going to be a really exciting 48-hour time period between September 16th and September 18th. Why is that? Well, on September 16th, Judge Merchan has already told us he will hand down his decision on whether the presidential immunity ruling from the Supreme Court means Judge Merchan has to throw out the entire case against Donald Trump. I will predict he will not throw out the case against Donald Trump. So on September 16th, assuming we get the opinion that Judge Merchan has promised us, the next thing that will happen in the case is 48 hours later, September 18th, Donald Trump is scheduled to go to sentencing. So why is that 48 hours going to be really exciting? Because what I predict Donald Trump will do is he will engage in a figurative foot race to every appellate court, both state and federal, that he can possibly get a filing submitted to, and he will be begging every appellate court judicial panel to put a stop to his sentencing that is scheduled on the 18th. So let's talk about the reason he will be filing these motions and what the prospects are for these motions succeeding. So ordinarily, you don't get to appeal something until your case is over. What does that mean? Well, you've been indicted, you've been tried, you've been convicted, and you've been sentenced. That is when your appellate rights come into existence. That's when they are born. And before you are sentenced, before the case is over, you ordinarily can't appeal anything with a couple of exceptions. One of those exceptions is immunity, right? If you actually have immunity against prosecution, legitimate immunity, well, then you shouldn't be forced to go through an entire trial, be sentenced, and then appeal your legal right not to have been tried in the first place. You can feel the friction there. That's why it's one of the very few exceptions to the rule that you can't appeal until the case is over. So, we now have the Supreme Court, after Donald Trump was convicted by a jury of his peers in New York of 34 felonies, all committed with the intent to steal the 2016 presidential election. That was Donald Trump's motive for committing those false business records crimes. He was trying to cover up the true nature of the hush money payments he made to Stormy Daniels. After he was convicted by a jury, that's when the Supreme Court handed down this harebrained, unconstitutional opinion that said presidents can't be prosecuted for the most part, with a couple of exceptions. So it was then up to Judge Merchan to figure out, okay, what in the world does that Supreme Court precedent, that new ruling, mean for whether my conviction in New York is still sound and I can proceed to sentencing against Donald Trump? So we had the parties, the prosecution and the defense attorneys, brief it up, submit the briefs, and he announced in writing, Judge Merchan did, I will decide this issue on September 16th, and I will be handing down my written opinion. So if he decides, you know what, this conviction survives the Supreme Court presidential immunity ruling, and I believe he will then say, and folks, I'll see you in 2 days when I will sentence Donald Trump. So that is where Donald Trump will say, wait a minute, I have this right to what's called an interlocutory appeal even before my case is over, even before I have been sentenced. And he will undoubtedly run to the New York Court of Appeals, trying to get them to put a stop to his sentencing date 2 days later. And he will probably try to file some kind of a writ, a request for review of this very same issue in the federal court and try to bubble it up to the Supreme Court within that 48-hour timetable. So, if the New York criminal prosecution of Donald Trump were an action-adventure movie, come September 16th, we're going to be in that last car chase scene where we're all going to be on the edge of our seats seeing, will Donald Trump be sentenced on September 18th or won't he? So that's kind of where we are and what we can expect come mid-September.
Glenn, do you believe that Judge Merchan said that he was going to make the decision on the 16th so as purposefully to only give Donald Trump just a little bit of time if he were to seek that interlocutory appeal?
I like the way you think, but I am not going to project that motive on Judge Merchan. Listen, I think he gave the parties an appropriate amount of time to brief up the case, make their best arguments, and then he said he would decide it on the 16th. He obviously also needed some time to plow through what is a largely nonsensical Supreme Court ruling about how trial court judges are to go about deciding whether certain acts of a president are official, whether they're not official, whether they're private, whether they should enjoy some modicum of presidential immunity or not. So I don't think he was intentionally putting it on that sort of short, fused timetable, but that's where it is. So we'll see what he says on the 16th, and then we'll see what Donald Trump's lawyers scramble to do in that 48-hour period.
Glenn, let me ask you this. If it was a regular defendant and not Donald Trump, how likely would they be to be successful seeking this interlocutory appeal in both the New York court system and the federal court system? And then I want to know what you think about it being Donald Trump. Do you think he's more likely to be successful in either New York or the federal court system?
Yeah, now in fairness, because this is an interlocutory appeal based on a brand new Supreme Court ruling, I think anybody who was similarly situated to Donald Trump would get the same play that Donald Trump is getting. Of course, who would be similarly situated? Another president
right.
who tried to overturn the expressed will of the American voters and unlawfully retain the power of the presidency. It's not like they're a dime a dozen. Donald Trump is
right.
really in a category unto himself. And the other thing, Brian, is immunity issues are usually cut and dry. First of all, they're not accomplished through judicial fiat, the way the Supreme Court just did this enormous favor for Donald Trump. In fact, there is case law that says judges don't have the power to grant immunity from prosecution. You know why? That's a separation of powers problem. Only the executive branch, only the prosecution has the right, has the authority, has the governmental power to grant somebody immunity from prosecution. Courts do not. So immunity issues are usually cut and dry. Why? Because ordinarily it is me, when I was a prosecutor, granting immunity to someone and then compelling them to testify. So then to the second part of your question, Brian, how likely is it that Donald Trump will succeed? I hate to say this, and I know our viewers will probably hate to hear it. I have a feeling he's got a pretty good shot at getting some play in either the New York State Court of Appeals or in the federal courts, because this is such an unusual, indeed unprecedented circumstance that it may be Judge Merchan, even on his own accord says, you know what, I deny your motion, but I'm going to give you some time to appeal it, because I know ordinarily on issues involving immunity, litigants get an instant appeal. They don't have to wait until they're sentenced. So like I say, this is going to be a really exciting 48 hours. I don't know which way Judge Merchan is going to go on whether he will proceed to sentencing or not, but I do suspect one or more appellate courts, either state or federal, might be interested enough in this issue that they'll say, okay, not so fast, cool your jets. We're going to decide this issue before we force Donald Trump to go to sentencing.
Which raises this point too, and I think that this is an important part to end off with here. There are going to be people who are watching this right now and who are going to say, of course Donald Trump is going to get away with it. I already know that it's going to happen. He gets away with everything. This whole system is rigged against us. What's the point of doing any of this? What do you say to those people?
Do not lose faith, because even though the wheels of justice could not turn any more slowly when it comes to Donald Trump, if we look back more than a year ago now, people were saying Donald Trump will never be indicted for anything. What do we have today? 4 criminal indictments. Donald Trump will never be made to go to trial. Donald Trump went to trial once, and he will go to trial 3 more times, notwithstanding the fact that Judge Cannon dismissed the Florida case. That case will be resurrected by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And then people said, well, Donald Trump will never be convicted even if he is forced to go to trial. And Donald Trump is convicted of 34 felony crimes in violation of New York state law. So do not lay your bet on Donald Trump will never be sentenced or Donald Trump will never be imprisoned. Brian, as frustrated as we feel sometimes, I believe those days are coming. Donald Trump will be sentenced, and I absolutely believe Donald Trump will end up in an orange jumpsuit with his butt in a cell. Why? Because judges and prosecutors understand that if you don't punish crime, if you don't deter others from committing similar crimes in the future, then you're giving it all away to anybody who wants to cheat in an election, to anybody who wants to be a dictator on day one. So have faith, don't lose faith. And the best way to make yourself feel good is by going to the polls on November 5th and voting Donald Trump guilty. You all have been selected as the final jury that will sit in judgment between Donald Trump and dictatorship, between today and November 5th. Go to the polls, and yes, we are going to affirmatively vote for the Harris-Walz ticket because we are energized, we are inspired, and they're the right leaders for the moment. But you know what? While you're casting that vote, you can also think that, you know what? I am a member of the final jury, and I also vote Donald Trump guilty by voting for Harris-Walz.
Perfectly put. Exactly the kind of optimistic message we need to end this off with. So, of course, as far as all of these prosecutions and this upcoming sentencing are concerned, if you want to stay on top of that as that process plays out, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen, including Glenn's, who is fast on his way to 1 million subscribers. So if you haven't yet subscribed to his channel, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.